foundations. Not the kind of foundations that we build houses on, but the kind of foundations on which a person is going to build his life. And so, in the Sermon on the Mount, talk about the live it part of your theme for this summer. That's what the Sermon on the Mount is. It is Jesus telling us about kingdom citizenship. If you're going to be my follower in just a dramatically practical way, the Lord kind of lays that out in the Sermon on the Mount and says, this is what it looks like, what you look like when you live under my reign. That's what he's been saying leading up to the end of the sermon here in Matthew 7. And so before he's done, he shares this simple but powerful parable designed to move his audience to act on what he's just told them to do. The parable at the end here, the parable of the two builders, I think, is one of the most familiar of Jesus' parables. Maybe it's because of the kids' song with the cool hand gestures. Mark, can you lead that? Okay, I'm just kidding. But you know, right? The wise man built his house upon the rock, right? You know the song? But it has a powerful message for us. And so let's read it together tonight, and that will, no pun intended, lay the foundation for our study. So this is Matthew 7. Look down at verse 24, where Jesus says, therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Verse 26, everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and slammed against that house. And the children would say, the foolish man's house went splat. Oh, that was good. Somebody else join me. Very good. I like that. And great was its fall. I want us to spend some time working three pieces of this simple story, the parable of the two builders. Because I think first it's going to tie back to what y'all have been thinking about this summer, particularly that piece of living it. What is it that moves us to live it? And to do that, I want us to look at the three, I think, chief pieces of the story and how the Lord knits them together to make this final point. I want to say sort of not just the ultimate point of the lesson, but the ultimate point of our lives using this really simple story. So let's pull the parable apart and talk about it a little bit. The first piece I want to talk about is the builders, because that's who the story centers on, right? Two guys who undertake what people of all time in all places have always been doing. They are building places for themselves to live. They are building houses. To be clear, we're supposed to see ourselves in the builders. We are the builders. He's not thinking of houses, though. He's thinking about lives. All of us are building lives. We've all been allotted a measure of time and opportunity and resources. We don't get all the same materials. Some get more, we get different quality of materials, but everyone gets something to build with. We are all builders. See yourselves in the parable tonight. But we don't all build in the same way. Some people, just like some house builders, are haphazard and thoughtless. You've seen the people who just sort of slide through life, drifting from day to day, just basically trying to get through the day, and they squander resources and they miss opportunities and along the way exasperate their parents, right? And then there are people who are just the opposite of that. When it comes to life, they are goal-oriented and intentional, and they're determined to take whatever the Lord gives them and to make the most of it in whatever time that they have to live here. Those are the extremes. And in between, well, that's the rest of us, falling maybe more toward one side or the other, but we're all building. And the Lord has something to say about it. He had something in mind for these materials that he entrusted to us, something that he wants us to do with them. That's what the Sermon on the Mount is about. What do we do with what the Lord gave us? What kind of life are we to build? And so as the Lord is winding down that sermon and coming here to the end, there is still one crucial decision left to be made. The decision that defines life. And Jesus will focus on that with a second piece to the story. He first talks about the builders, and then he begins talking about the foundations. I told you that's what he's concerned about here at the end. And it's a key part of the parable because it's when you get to the foundations that the two builders part company, right? They choose different foundations. The first guy, we're told, built on the rock. In fact, I like Luke's telling of this story because Luke said he dug deep and laid his foundation on the rock. That just sounds harder, doesn't it? I suspect that it took more time, certainly a lot more effort to get down to some bedrock that was solid and there lay his foundation. He had to spend a lot more to build that way, and yet I think we all understood why he did that, right? I mean, you want to get out of some good bedrock so you have something nice and solid to lay your foundation on so that it will be sturdy and that the house will be sturdy. The other guy makes a different choice. Builds his house on the sand. And in every way, at first blush, that looks like it's easier. In fact, these two guys are building their house at the same time. I think this guy's work was a lot easier. I think it was a lot quicker. I think he's sipping tea on the front porch, watching his neighbor finish up. He got it done way ahead of the other guy. And I suspect that in the end, their houses probably look the same from the outside, don't you imagine? Couldn't really tell that one was different from the other. Time is going to tell a different story, and we'll get to that. But before we do, we need to find ourselves in this part of the story. Because like the two builders, brothers and sisters, we are choosing a foundation too. And that's the Lord's concern when he gets to the end here. What he really wants us to do is build life on the right foundation. And so the question is, what is that? And he answers that for us very simply. Look at verse 24. The wise builder is the one who hears the words of Jesus and acts on them. That builder is building a life that will endure. And then look at verse 26. Are you looking there? At 26, the foolish builder is the one who hears the words of Jesus and does not act on them. That's the fool whose house is headed for destruction. And so what is amazing to me is here at the end of this sermon, Jesus makes life really, really simple. Boils down to one choice. Either I hear him and do what he says, or I don't. Those are the only options, only two ways to go through life. We choose one, we choose the other, but everyone decides, everyone picks a foundation. And it is the most critical decision in life that then affects everything else that we do. His audience has heard what he had to say. Now, what Jesus wants to know is, will you do it? Now, the interesting thing to me is that this is not the first time Jesus confronts his audience with this choice. In fact, Jesus is a preacher kind of like some of us as preachers. He's been concluding for a long time. So if you'll back up with me a little bit, before he talks about the two foundations, Jesus first talked about the two paths. So back up to verse 13. I think this is really where he starts wrapping up in Matthew 7 and verse 13. When he says, enter through the narrow gate. Remember this? Does this ring familiar? For the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who enter through it. For the gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and there are few that find it. So before there were two foundations, the Lord talked about two paths. But even in his description of them, they kind of sound like the two foundations, right? You got rock and sand. And now you have broad way and narrow way. And like the two foundations, one sounds easier than the other, doesn't it? That broad way sounds like it's a lot easier to travel. John Stott, in his excellent book on the Sermon on the Mount, describes this path as the road of tolerance and permissiveness. It doesn't have any curbs or boundaries of either thought or conduct. Travel the broad way and do whatever you want. Live how you choose. And the fact that most people go that way through life, everyone else is moving that direction, sort of lends to this perception that it is the right way to go. The other path, not so much. Jesus says that the gate to this path in verse 14 is small and the way is narrow. And the more we read that, the more we get the sense that maybe this is a harder way to go. There are curbs, there are boundaries. People who travel this way allow God to set limits and make rules, and they discipline themselves to follow those rules. In fact, that's why a lot of people don't want to go this way. It's not as much fun. You're tied down. I'd rather go the other way, where I can do what I want to do and live like I want to live. That's a better way. Again, at least at first blush. You know, the problem with people that travel Broadway is they just don't look very far down the road. They're just kind of living in the moment. Suddenly you start projecting that out a little bit, and thankfully narrow way folks feel a whole better about their choice than those taking the other path. Because the broad path has potholes in it. Inevitably, brothers and sisters, the choice to sin carries with it the grief and sorrow that goes with that sin. Listen, whether you think something is sinful or not, if the Lord says it's wrong and harmful, mark it down. Somewhere down there, you're going to have a head-on collision with that. You're going to hit that and be forced to face reality. I think that's why narrow path people are ultimately happier with their choice. One of the great things about being a disciple is that every decision not to sin carries with it the blessing that you don't have to suffer the consequences of that sin. But that's not the more important reason to travel the narrow path. You'll notice, going back to verses 13 and 14, that the Lord says that both of the paths have a destination, right? You see that? And he tells us about that. This broad path is leading to destruction. The narrow path leads to life. Let's make that real simple. The narrow way takes you to heaven, and the broad way takes you to hell. It's the only two possibilities. It's so odd that our mixed-up world has found the capacity to embrace heaven and to deny the reality of hell. Odd because the source for heaven is where you also find the source for hell. It's logically unsound not to believe in both. There are not many paths that are all ultimately going to the same place. That's not what the source teaches about that. The Lord said there are only two, and they go to different places. I know that's a narrow view of life that a lot of people in our culture today would find terribly offensive, but would you remember with me, just because something offends people doesn't mean it isn't true. And it's because it is true that the Lord here begins verse 13 with an appeal. Enter by the narrow gate. Why? Because everything is at stake in this choice. You see, in the end, it's two foundations, rock or sand. But in the beginning, when he began his conclusion, it was the broad way or the narrow way. Everybody chooses. Now, we need to say more about that, because if you look down at verse 15, Jesus warns us that our ability to get on the right path is going to be complicated because of false teachers. And so in verse 15, he continues, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. And he adds at the beginning of 16, you shall know them by their fruits. It's As we try to figure out which way to go, the false prophet muddies the water. He confuses us about what is required to get on the narrow path. And then once there, he tries to convict us that it's not really as restrictive as we might be led to believe. And ultimately, there are false teachers who say it really doesn't matter what path you take through life. All paths ultimately lead to God, no matter which road we travel. And so Jesus again warns in verse 15, beware false prophets. Brothers and sisters, we need to be very careful about the voices we choose to hear and the teaching we choose to embrace. Before we leave this, can I point out to you two implications that are wrapped up in this warning, beware of false prophets? There are two important realities that lie underneath that deserve some attention, and I don't want to pass by without pointing them out to you. First of all, when the Lord says beware of false prophets, that necessarily implies that false prophets are a real thing. Are you with me on that? I'm sometimes amazed, Mark, at what I feel like I need to get up and say, right? I never imagined 30 years ago I'd feel like I need to stand up in front of an audience and say, all religious teaching is not equally valid. There's stuff that's true and there's stuff that's false. But in our generation, brothers and sisters, we need to say that. All religious teaching is not equally valid. There are people who tell the truth and point us toward the narrow path, and Jesus would say there are false prophets who want to confuse you about which way that you ought to go. It has always been that way. Back in Jeremiah 27 and verse 9, Jeremiah warned the people of his day, do not listen to your prophets, for they prophesy a lie to you. And then you get to the New Testament, and in Galatians chapter 1 and verse 6, Paul warns that there were some who were distorting the gospel of Christ. And our time is not going to be any different than that. So it is today, that there are some seeking to distort the gospel and confuse us about how we ought to go. False prophets, false teaching, it's a real thing. And for that reason, we need to be very thoughtful about whose voice we choose to hear and what teaching we choose to embrace. And so one of the things I think this warning implies is that false teachers are a real thing. The second thing that I think the warning implies is that we can know the difference. If Jesus says, beware of false teachers, then that implies that I have some way of measuring and determining who is telling the truth and who is not. And I think Jesus supplies us with that statement. He claimed to be the source of truth and to provide the only access to the Father. So let's make this simple. Anybody who agrees with Jesus is telling the truth. And anyone teaching a message that is in conflict with Jesus is not telling the truth. That message is false. You see, ultimately, every message can be judged by an objective standard. This idea that truth is subjective, that what is true for you may not be true for me, brothers and sisters, that is a deception from the devil designed to help people feel comfortable with the broad path. It is not so. The Lord provided an objective standard of truth, and what he expects me and you to do is to measure all that we hear by the standard Jesus supplied. We need to be very careful about the voices we choose to hear, message we choose to embrace. That's especially important because Jesus teaches us that these false teachers are deceptive. Did you notice that? They do not always appear as they really are. Jesus says that sometimes it appears that they are among the sheep. And in verse 22 of Matthew 7, they claim to do great works in the name of Jesus. But backing up to verse 15, he's already told us what they really are wolves disguised. Does that scare you? I have to tell you, going down through this section, I find this to be one of the most frightening sections anywhere in all of the Bible. That there can be people who put on this cloak of spirituality and give this presentation of being very pious and religious and carry the Lord's book around and talk about his book. And in reality, when you pull back the disguise, they're really wolves, threaten to devour us. So he would go on in verse 16 to comfort us and to tell us that we can know. He switches symbols. And he said, you'll know them by their fruit. And so, like a tree eventually bears its fruit, and we know what kind of tree it is, so these teachers eventually show their true colors, and we can know them for who they are. And we must do that. Because everything is at stake. Have you noticed that going through the end of this chapter? What did he say back up in verse 13? The broad way leads to destruction. In verse 23, we're told that even those who are very religious and claim to do works in the name of Jesus, if those people do not obey him, they're told to depart in the end. And in verse 21 of chapter 7, we're told that only those who do the will of the Father will enter the kingdom of heaven. So we need to be very careful about the voices we choose to hear, the teaching we choose to embrace. So what do we have? As Jesus is wrapping up this sermon, what do we have? It seems to me that the Lord uses three different figures ultimately to make the same point with us. He starts with these two paths, broad way or narrow way. And then he talks about these two teachers, or these two voices that we might hear. The one who teaches truth and the one who is the false prophet. And then when we come to the parable at the very end, we're given these two foundations. We build either on rock or on sand. But ultimately, folks, they're all driving back to the same point. Jesus has preached this fabulous lesson. Will we hear? Will we do what he said? That's the question that hangs at the end of the great sermon. It's not just acknowledging these are great truths. What the Lord wants to know is, will you submit and humble yourself and do what I said to do? It is the question upon which all of life is built. Will we obey Jesus or not? But there's a third piece to the sermon we need to talk about. That points up why it is so. I can't figure out which screen I would look at, Mark. I'm going this way, I'm going that way. There's a reason. It's vital. We make the right choice. Because the storms are coming. And that's the third piece of the story. Foundations are not the only problem for homeowners in Southeast Texas, where I live. In the late summer months, the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico can stir up a big storm and send a hurricane our way with all those powerful winds and rain and flood waters. And I will tell you what a storm like that does. It tests your house. Good, strong hurricane will tell you what kind of house you live in and how that house was made. I can tell you that from first-hand experience. I've seen some homes take hours and hours of winds in excess of 120 miles an hour, and when it was all over, it was right there. Maybe you had to adjust the shingles a little bit, or shutters a little bit, put a few shingles on, but the house was there. It stood. And I have seen the opposite too. I have seen the debris in the yard where the house stood. The house that didn't survive the storm. The house that went splat, right? If a builder wants his house to withstand the storm, he must build for the storm. Does that make sense? Do you see what I'm saying? If a builder wants his house to withstand the storm, he has to build for the storm. And if you look back to verse 24, that's what we're being told about the wise man. He built for the storm. That's why I went to all the trouble to dig down deep and find that bedrock and set his foundation there. He wasn't doing that thinking about the sunny days. He was thinking about the rain and the wind. He was thinking about the storm, and he built with that in view. The foolish man did not do that. He only built for the sunny days. And how did that turn out? Think about how this all ends up. We have to build for the storm. It is folly not to do it, because they are coming. People are going to lose their jobs. How many disciples over the last few months experienced the storm of financial adversity? I mean, I don't know how it is here, but folks, Houston, they're dropping like flies. People are losing their jobs, and then they're in economic distress. But sometimes it's worse things than that. There are going to be spouses who are unfaithful to each other, who are going to destroy their families. Children are going to lose their faith and devastate their parents. People that we love and care about are going to contract terrible diseases that linger and cause suffering and then take life. Count on it. Storms are coming for all of us. But like the two houses in the story, not everybody responds to the storm in the same way. Have you noticed that? I have seen people who are just overwhelmed and flooded by grief and sorrow to the point that it just emotionally drowned them. They were never the same after their tragedy, after their storm. Do you know people like that? And I've seen people who were exactly the opposite. Some awful thing would happen to them, and what did they do? They just bore up and got closer and depended on God more than ever. And oddly enough, when it was over, their faith was stronger and richer and deeper than it was before the storm. How does it work out that way? How is it people respond in such dramatically different ways? Jesus has given us the answer, folks. He said it's about the foundation. What are you building on? In fact, what he says is that it is only the man who completely entrusts himself to me, Jesus said, who is so trusting of me that he's willing to humbly submit to whatever my will is for his life. It is only that man who is ready when the storms come. It has been just a few days longer than 2 years ago. A Wednesday in early June of 2018, that I was sitting in my office prepping to come here and speak for you, when my phone rang. And it was my mom. She was very upset. She said she had just heard that my niece Emily had been rushed to the hospital. And she said something about the paramedics trying to resuscitate her. And I thought, Mom is confused about that. But we were concerned, so we went home and threw some clothes in a suitcase, and we took off for Houston. We were hardly out of Beaumont when the second call came, telling us that Emily had died. I have to tell you that I really couldn't process that when I first heard those words. Emily was young. She's 32 years old. Mother of 3 little boys, at that time 6, 4, and 2. She had just finished her education. She had just been credentialed to begin her work as a family therapist. She was in her first year of that. She was a young, healthy woman. People like that don't wake up one morning and die. As we navigated the very difficult days that followed that Wednesday, we were able to vividly see how the Lord supplies his people with the things they need to weather the storms. I mean, it began in the moment. Our brothers and sisters descended on the emergency room. Mark, I think 50 people were there. They had to give us our own wing. Crying with us, praying with us, grieving with us. And then in the days that follow, you know what that looks like. I mean, there were just cards and text messages and Facebook posts, and people brought food and more food and more food, and whatever we needed, it was there. They took care of us. But more importantly than any of that, we did not grieve as those who have no hope. We were able to comfort ourselves in the knowledge that Emily was with the Lord. And that though we were parted for a time, we were already anticipating the grand reunion that was coming when we would all be together again. And it was things like that, supplied by God and His people, that helped us navigate those difficult, dark days. I will tell you, more than once during all of that ordeal, I thought to myself, what do people do who don't have this? How do they survive? And the more I pondered that, the more I realized that a lot of people don't. They're emotionally wrecked by their storms. And they never recover. They never recover emotionally. Some end up in a bottle or with medications. Some take their lives because they don't have anyone to manage the storm. I'll tell you, brothers and sisters, building for the sunny days will get you through the sunny days, but it will leave you unprepared for the storms. And they are surely coming. Now, if I'm going to be honest with this text, I'm forced to acknowledge that there may be something else or something different or something more that the Lord has in mind here than what I've just described for you as He describes this storm in this parable. I will tell you why I say that. As I read through this last half of Matthew 7, Jesus is clearly thinking about the end. Have you seen that? There is destruction, verse 13, at the end of the broad path. And in verse 19, there's the fire that consumes the bad tree. And then there's that language at the end of verses 22 and 23, talking about that day when the lawless are told to depart. And so as he concludes this parable, and he talks about this great storm that is coming that tests every man's foundation, I will tell you, it makes me wonder if at no other time, certainly in the end when the trumpet sounds and Jesus comes and men are judged, all the veneers are going to be gone and we will stand before God as we really are. And it may be that that's what the Lord is talking about here. It may be that what Jesus is trying to say is in that last great day, only the man who built on this foundation will be able to stand. Only the man who trusted me enough to do what I said. John Stott said this, commenting on this section of the sermon. He said that the question is not whether we say nice, polite, orthodox, enthusiastic things to or about Jesus, nor whether we hear his words, listening, studying, pondering, and memorizing until our minds are stuffed with his teaching. But whether we do what we say and do what we know. In other words, whether the lordship of Jesus, which we profess, is one of life's major realities. And I love that because it's a perfect segue to the closing verses of chapter 7. Are you still there? Because the way Matthew will end this in verse 28 is by saying, when Jesus had finished these words, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as their scribes. I love that. In the very end, what Matthew does is he points us to what is truly important about this sermon. And it isn't what Jesus said. What is truly important is who said it. Our brother Paul Arnhart made this observation of the verse. He said, "At last we are not so much confronted with the compelling and challenging message of the great sermon as we are with the person of the preacher himself." So let's add that to the slide. In the end, the story is really about the teacher. The crowd seemed to get it. As they listened to Jesus, they acknowledged he is not like other teachers. And they even seemed to get what it was. He taught them as one having authority. I don't know if they have it all put together yet, but they're headed in the right direction. The question is, do we see? You know, it's interesting, brothers and sisters, that we would protest loudly if someone came along and treated Jesus just like a man, wouldn't we? Even if they were willing to say, "I think Jesus is a great moral teacher, and his teaching ought to be studied and considered," we would protest and we would say, "That's not nearly enough. He was so much more than that." But the question for me and you sitting in the room tonight is he that to us? In Luke's telling of the story, he begins with a question. In Luke 6 and verse 46, Jesus asked, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say?" Bluntly, our resistance to the teacher should make us question what we believe about the teacher. Brothers and sisters, as he is the Lord, how is it that we quibble over his instructions? Or worse yet, twist his words to fit what I'm already determined to do? If what we believe about Jesus is true, there's only one response to him: to bow the knee and humbly submit before the King and let him rule. Brings us back to the point of the parable. Jesus says it is the man who hears his words and acts on them who is building a life that will endure. He is the man that will be able to stand when the last great storm comes. And so, brothers and sisters, let us build for the storm. If you're here tonight and your foundation is not set in Jesus Christ, your commitment to do his will, you're sitting in a room full of people who love you and care about you and will love nothing more than to help you do that, support you in a walk that acknowledges Jesus as the Lord. So if you need to acknowledge that tonight and ask for help from your church family, this is your time to do that. Make your way to the front right now while we stand, while we sing.